Welcome back. A commander-in-chief taking decisive action and a newly minted Supreme Court justice. The chemical attack by Syria's dictator Assad on his own people is an atrocity. It was also an opportunity for Trump to do a 180 on his long-held position to stay out of Syria. The Supreme Court picked Neil Gorsuch is being confirmed despite reservations. Many Republicans voted for Trump because he would get to make an appointment to the high court. However, congressional Republicans had to blow up Senate rules to confirm Gorsuch after a Democratic filibuster, and there's still Russia. The House Intelligence Chair stepping down because of his questionable actions during the probe into whether the Trump campaign colluded with the Russians during the presidential campaign. And joining us for analysis is David Samuel, president of the Northport Area Republican Club, Keith Fitzgerald, political science professor at New College of Florida. He was also a Democratic member of the Florida House, and Mitch Perry, reporter for FloridaPolitics.com. Gentlemen, welcome, and David, welcome to the trapezoid.
Thank you very much.
Obviously, the story of the day is Syria, and David, let me get your take here, because up until today, I mean, over how many years did Trump tweet out urging President Obama not to get involved in Syria, and some 70 days into his administration, he's bombing it?
Well, Mr. Trump, or President Trump, I believe is adapting to the situations as they occur. This is something he does very well. That's why a lot of people voted for him. In Northport, which is South County, voters wanted someone who would stand up to monsters like Syrian president, Iran, and Russia. And this is what he's doing right now.
Although, you know, again, during the campaign and prior to it, he said that there is nothing the U.S. can gain out of getting involved with this.
Well, like I say, he's adapting to the situation as it occurs. His advisors are telling him what they need to do, what he needs to do, and he's adapting to that and following direction of.
Well, and I think you saw it. You know, you're right. I mean, he said something, but again, yeah, when you are actually in the Oval Office and have the command of the world at your hands, things are different. It would take President Trump at his word. He was emotionally reacting to what happened when we saw the footage from Tuesday from the chemical attack, which has happened actually many times over the years. We remember mostly in 2013 when President Obama had went over his red line, which of course he ultimately decided not to act. You know, the question is what happens next, all right? I mean, this is like a major event, but as you even heard in the setup here, Mitch McConnell talks about we don't need to discuss this in Congress. A lot of Republicans and Democrats say it should come before Congress.
You know, Trump tweeted that the president has to get the okay from Congress, which he has not done yet.
Yeah, and so I would like to think that this is some sign of decisiveness and understanding. I don't think it is really. Remember, these are the very same people, the Syrians and the Russians, who Donald Trump has spent the last year and a half cozying up to and apologizing for. I think part of what's happened is that there's been a shift in power within the White House, and he's listening now to established hands, but that's for today.
Right. Let me ask you this, Keith, because one can debate whether or not this strike will be effective, whether it is part of an actual strategy, but it looks good. The president looked presidential last night. He was decisive. And in the position that he is, he's had a number of real rough weeks. Isn't this what he needed?
Well, first of all, I don't think that there's a whole lot of disagreement that the measure itself was an appropriate one. And had he gone to Congress to get approval, I think he would have gotten it, and very quickly. It was proportionate. I don't think anybody, on the other hand, thinks it's going to tip the balance, change the map over there in any significant way. It was a simple statement that we can't do this. But what we don't see is any clear coherence or plan. And when you send signals, they have a much greater impact when people know exactly what they mean. And we have similar concerns with what's going on in North Korea as well, where sending a signal is only valuable if it's part of an overall picture that everyone can interpret.
Well, you know, and he says, you know, he's been cozying up to Russia, but he talks about the association with Russia. Well, this, you know, Russia is not happy with what happened last night. And Rex Tillerson, who's been very somnolent for his first 7 weeks as Secretary of State, has been quite outspoken the last 24 hours. I don't know if he's found his voice in this whole action. Nikki Haley, we've seen what she's been talking about at the United Nations. So, you know, one of the reasons why people didn't want the United States to get involved at all in Syria is because you've got Russia already involved there. And I know we gave them a call to warn them ahead of time, but this now creates something that didn't exist 24 hours ago.
You know, David, if you were to be a conspiracy theorist, you would say that this, in some measure, is a good way to show that you are not cozying up to Russia because of all the investigations that have taken place up until now.
Well, I wouldn't even consider that, but let me mention, going back to what we're talking about before, first of all, Congress approves declaration of wars. This was something that had to be done quickly, and that's why President Trump did not go right to congressmen at that very instant. Also, a cohesive plan where there's details. I think he mentioned in his campaigning that he's not going to tell folks what he's going to do, the enemy. He can give general statements, but there has to be some suspense. Right. And also, there's a lot of support going on in neighboring countries, Turkey, Jordan.
All right, we're going to pick up this conversation in just a moment after we check the weather. Welcome back. Missile strikes going nuclear, shaking up the investigation into Russia. If you're just joining us, we're discussing a busy week in Washington. Our guests tonight are David Samuel of the Northport Republican Club, political science professor Keith Fitzgerald, and politics reporter Mitch Perry. Gentlemen, you know, as I said at the outset, a lot of people, a lot of good Republicans who were not really thrilled with Donald Trump voted for him because of the Supreme Court nomination, which happened today. Neil Gorsuch is going to be a Supreme Court justice. It's very hard to argue that this is not a feather in the cap of Donald Trump, Keith.
Well, it's a direct outcome of the election. Elections matter. They won, and they also won in the Senate, at least enough to have the majority, and that was it. I think that what the Democrats did not do a great job of, I'll criticize the Democratic Party on this, is they could never figure out how to message this guy, because they tried to make it a personal appeal, and they tried to make it out like he might be biased against different groups or individuals. The fact of the matter is, the reason that people on the left side, or the center for that matter, should be upset about Gorsuch is that he is probably the most philosophically extreme Supreme Court justice we've had in 100 years.
Right, but that was not the only reason why the Democrats opposed him. It is, Dave, because a lot of Democrats believe that this is a stolen seat, that Merrick Garland was not even given a hearing, and that that therefore, you know, this was a stolen seat, and that's not fair play.
That's still not a good reason, because in the past, when Mr. Gorsuch was being approved for, I believe, a federal district court, he had strong support from the Democrats in the vote. And all of a sudden, we're seeing politics again. And this is where a lot of people are getting sick of this. A lot of Republicans voted for Trump because you've probably heard the chants, drain the swamp. And they're seeing the same thing happen again in this situation. And they're tired of it.
Mitch, you know, the Supreme Court was talked about during the presidential campaign, but in the end, in terms of when you covered the electorate, all those rallies out there, just people who, you know, are working on a daily basis, did they really think about the Supreme Court and the implications?
I do think they did, because, you know, I mean, depends obviously on what specific voters, but that really, you know, look, we all know Hillary Clinton, there was not a huge wellspring of enthusiasm, but people would say, you know what, though, I worry about the Supreme Court. That was something that Democrats talked about. I want to say something, though. You know, today there's a big deal because the nuclear option was unveiled here, and he got, you know, was approved with less than 60 votes. Personally, I'm okay with that. You know, I mean, I know that because this is not like it's sacred in the Constitution. This is something that the filibusters come up in, you know, in recent decades, and you'd like to get, you know, a consensus. But I personally think even on regular up and down votes in Congress that they shouldn't do this, because it's so hard to pass things with 60 votes
right,
these days.
But the difference is, what people are afraid about is if you only need 51 votes to get a Supreme Court justice, that presidents, whether they're Republican or Democrat, are going to nominate the most polarizing, the most true liberal or conservative, and that is dangerous for the court for years to come. Dave?
Alan, I'd like to go back to what you were asking, what the people were thinking during the election about a Supreme Court justice. I was at the early voting table in Northport every single day, and a lot of people mentioned that. And we're talking about young and old. In fact, Democrats that were now switching over to the Republican ticket. And a lot of folks, that was a main concern.
And I know it was a concern among Democrats, Keith, but it was not a motivator.
Well, I think most people had their position on that pretty well staked out. So Democrats were on one side and Republicans on the other. But it was mentioned a lot of times in decisions. And I would like to say about the filibuster is that I think your point about the Supreme Court being a little bit different is a salient one. And part of the problem is that the partisanship leads to now the court becoming so ideologically polarized that any kind of middle ground is becoming tougher and tougher, and that's a big deal. On policy issues, I agree with you, actually. I think what they got to do is go back to the old way you did a filibuster, that you could only filibuster if you actually filibustered.
Right, like Strom Thurmond did back in the day.
And gentlemen, let's make it clear, other things have not gone away, including the Russia investigation, and we saw today something, not today, earlier this week, something absolutely incredible where the House Intelligence Committee Chairman, Devin Nunes, had to take a backseat in this investigation because of the kerfuffle over his taking information to the White House. Hey, what do you make of that?
Again, it's politics, and I think he's stepping out to help Trump and the Republicans and show that he understands and he wants to make sure that everything's done correctly. I believe the next chairman will be more careful and more select in what he does, or she. And is it Mr. Rooney from Florida?
Yes, our Congressman Rooney, who represents our area south of Clark Road, all the way up to Lake Okeechobee. He is now taking a leadership role on the investigation. But it also seems that you're acknowledging that Congressman Nunes screwed up.
Well, I'm not saying he screwed up. I think he's being a gentleman, and he wants to show that there's nothing to hide and that he's letting a new person take over and let the committee deal with it and do it the right way.
Well, look, when the Constitution was written, they did not think there would be political parties. And they thought that the branches of government would keep each other in check. And we should honor that aspect of the Constitution. It's unthinkable that a member of the congressional branch would be secretly going to the White House to do their bidding in a public relations show to undercut an investigation of the executive branch. That's just not the way this whole thing is supposed to work. So it's a big deal.
Mitch, up until now, tonight, we are talking about a missile strike, a Supreme Court nominee, a Russian investigation. What we're not talking about is legislation. You see that the Republicans are trying to, bring the health care bill back.
Yeah.
And
they talk about tax reform later this year.
Tax reform, infrastructure.
Right.
But there has been nothing so far in terms of...
there has not been a tangible victory, and that still needs to happen. And it's interesting because Congress is breaking for 2 weeks starting yesterday. And I know that the president met with Paul Ryan. And apparently, I was reading that he was trying to have a vote, not on the major thing, but on a smaller issue with health care just yesterday. And Ryan said, no way, we don't have it. We're not ready to do that. But Ryan did say in USA Today that he's prepared to come back in the next couple of months. I think that before the summer's over, they're coming back with that, though. They have to come back with that, right, Alan? I mean, that is not going away, and I don't think anybody in the Republican base are trying to get the Freedom Caucus to come around on this. So we're going to wait and see on that. Tax reform, which is another huge issue, that I'm very skeptical that's going to happen.
We have
this
less
year.
than a minute left. But Dave, I want to get your response, because how long do Republican voters stay patient in terms of they voted for repealing Obamacare and tax reform, and so far there are no signs that's any closer?
Okay, I think they understand that President Trump's only been in office 75 plus some days, and it takes a while to get situated and get these things done. As a political science, gentleman next to me understands that it's not simple to get bills to become laws.
Which is why it was crazy to try to vote for it in 2 weeks, like they were doing last month.
It shouldn't be so hard for the House of Representatives, though, because the Republicans were in the minority for 8 years, and they should have had all these things lined up on the runway ready to go, as, to their credit, the Democrats did back in 2009.
Okay, let's take a quick break, and when we return, we'll have final thoughts from our guests, and we'll hear what some of you are saying about the strike on Syria. Welcome back. A military strike on Syria, a Supreme Court confirmation, a shakeup in the probe in the Russian interference investigation. It was a busy week for the Trump administration. How will it impact the presidency going forward? Our guest joining us right now for final thoughts. Good week for the president, Dave, but is at some point, if something ticks him off, is he going to go back to his angry tweeting and cause another whatever?
I don't consider it angry tweeting. It's a form of communication. Young people love it.
Often untrue.
And he, he's countering the fake news that's out there, and he's coming out and he's giving his...
The fake news is not that President Obama tapped his phones or that 3 million illegals voted. So that stuff has gotten him into a lot of trouble.
Trump is Trump, and that's what's going to continue. And he'll probably slow down on that since he's got these crisis situations going on. But that's why a lot of people like him. Right. He's open with the people.
Keith?
So he had a good week in part because he listened to the Democrats in the White House. And I think
you mean his son-in-law?
His son-in-law and a couple of other advisors as well who are known to be Democrats. And it really has some of the people on the right very upset. But I think there's a reason for that, because the people are in the middle or on the modest left. And when he does things that seem to be in line with what most people want, his popularity will go up.
You're right. I mean, look at the health care bill, which was a disaster because who wanted it, right? 70% of the people, and it was totally this right-wing cabal who was like trying to push it through, and it was hurting his own voters. So he's not ideological. I think we've seen that. But when he wins with the Republican machine, that's when he's gotten in trouble. The travel ban, which is really kind of harsh, hardcore. Now, you mentioned about the tweeting. Tomorrow, Saturday morning, that's when he's been known to throw some of those wild ones out there. So we'll have to wait and see what happens by noon tomorrow.
All right, gentlemen, thank you. But before we go, we want to share with you what some of our viewers are saying about the U.S. strike on Syria. June Novak writes, here we go again. Rob Murphy writes, Obama made a deal with Russia to remove all the chemical weapons from Syria in 2014. So were they never removed? Where did Syria get them? Are these the WMDs that disappeared from Iraq when we invaded? Either way, if you're willing to use chemical weapons on your own people, what are you willing to do to the rest of the world? And Kathy Hart writes, I long for the day when the U.S. is no longer at war. Let us know what you think about the week in Washington. Join the conversation on our Facebook page at facebook.com/news@7. And FYI, want to watch past Roundtable discussions? They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. Thanks to our guests for being here tonight. David Samuel is president of the Northport Area Republican Club. Keith Fitzgerald is a political science professor at New College and former Democratic member of the Florida House. And Mitch Perry is a reporter for FloridaPolitics.com.